Another thing people like to talk about is AIDS in Africa. Everybody in Africa is dying, according to the press reports. This is new. This wasn't happening before. What can possibly be causing people to die in Africa if it's not a new virus? Well, the answer should be fairly obvious. There's been poverty and malnutrition for decades. The legacy of colonialism is still with Africa. There's been wars. There's been dictators. There's been famines. There are many, many reasons for people to be dying in Africa. But probably the biggest reason for people to die of AIDS in Africa is because the definition of AIDS in Africa is totally and utterly different than what's used in richer countries. According to the World Health Organization, they have a definition called the Bangui definition of AIDS. And if you have three of the following four symptoms, persistent cough, persistent fever, weight loss, and persistent diarrhea, three of those four symptoms, and you will be classified as AIDS without an HIV test. So essentially, they've redefined tuberculosis and malaria and malnutrition as AIDS. And on that definition, you can diagnose millions and millions of people in Africa with AIDS. But of course, they're not real numbers. They're estimates that come out of the World Health Organization in Geneva, that come out of the Centers for Disease Control. They come out of computer models. They're not real numbers. And it's not a real disease. It's a collection of symptoms of parasitic infections, tropical diseases, and just plain malnutrition. But instead of giving these people clean water, nutritious and adequate food, what do they need? Well, they need condoms, and they need expensive and toxic drugs. And one of the worst things about the drugs being given to Africans is that one of the most serious side effects of AIDS drugs is anemia. That is a red blood cell deficiency. AIDS drugs also cause deficiency of just about every type of blood cell. Africa has an epidemic of anemia because of malaria and also because of parasitic infections like hookworm infections. So giving AIDS drugs to people who are already anemic is going to make even more of them become, as they say in North America, transfusion dependent. But in Africa, you don't become transfusion dependent. You die, because there's no way to get transfusions on a regular basis. The people peddling AIDS drugs in Africa, the people at the United Nations, the World Health Organization, for the Centers for Disease Control, are going to be killing millions of people. There's an increasing recognition from these people that you cannot give AIDS drugs to people without food. But they don't have enough imagination to see that if you give people food, they don't need the AIDS drugs at all, because AIDS is a completely artificial construct. Another problem with AIDS in Africa is the belief, the myth, that AIDS or HIV is sexually transmitted. There was a recent survey in South Africa, for example, that showed that 24% of young black women were HIV positive. Now, given that it's known that men are more promiscuous than women, there's really no question about that, and the survey actually showed that that was the case. You would anticipate that men would have an even higher risk of HIV infection. But young black men had about a 6% risk of being HIV positive. So the infectious theory of HIV cannot explain why in many African countries there are more women than men who are HIV positive. In fact, there's no good explanation for that, except that HIV tests are vulnerable to a number of causes of false positives. About 70 different conditions have been identified that can cause false positive HIV tests, and many of those conditions exist in Africa. It could be exposure to certain types of birth control, to cosmetics, to skin lighteners. A number of things could be causing false positive HIV tests, but nobody really cares because the money in Africa is riding on a large number of people being diagnosed with HIV and AIDS. All of the organizations in Africa that have money are associated with AIDS. The organizations that drill wells, that help farmers feed themselves, and things like that, that's old-fashioned. Nobody wants to be involved with that. Everybody wants to be flying over, driving trucks around, teach people about safe sex and deliver condoms to villages or get everybody on drugs. There's been a considerable amount of work done on the whole issue of AIDS in Africa and the belief that it is a sexually transmitted epidemic. a group of scientists led by David Giselquist, and I'd like to point out that these are not dissidents, these are mainstream AIDS scientists, have questioned whether HIV in Africa looks and acts like a sexually transmitted epidemic. And their conclusions are that there are many reasons why it does not. There are babies who are HIV positive from HIV negative mothers. There are couples that are serodiscordant with one HIV positive, one HIV negative for years. There is the fact that in most countries there are more women than men who are HIV positive. There is somewhat of a connection between medical injections and being HIV positive. The Giselquist group interprets this as saying that dirty needles are causing HIV transmission. I think an alternative view to look at this is to say the more foreign substances you inject into your body, the higher the level of antibodies will be in your body, and the more likely you are to test HIV positive. It may not be infectious at all. But for a number of reasons, the public health bureaucracies, such as the World Health Organization, UNAIDS, organizations like that, are also heavily vested in widespread vaccination in Africa. And they do not want to talk about dirty needles because that will stop Africans from lining up for vaccinations. And so they have tried to shut down this whole discussion, this whole legitimate discussion on whether HIV is acting like a sexually transmitted epidemic in Africa. And reading the extensive scientific publications of the Giselquist group, one cannot help but conclude that it's not acting like a sexually transmitted epidemic. Okay. There have been a number of incredibly interesting studies that give a lot of evidence, that show a lot of evidence that HIV is not a sexually transmitted epidemic. I think one of the best was the Padian study, which was published in 1997. They studied a significant number of couples for about a decade. Some of those couples were serodiscordant. One was HIV positive, the other partner was HIV negative. And over the 10-year period of the study, not a